Thank you. Thank you guys for coming, and thank you for having me. And special thanks on behalf of my mom, who keeps saying, "When can I see you give a talk?" And now it'll be on the internet, so hi Mom, I guess. I should also start by saying I find it's really helpful if I let the audience know that when I make goofy or corny jokes, you have permission to laugh at them. Sometimes the audiences, they just feel like they are not allowed to laugh at my unfunny jokes, but I encourage it. So the talk today is Why Look to the Past? Historical Philosophy and the Virtue of Being Wrong. And it's nice because being wrong is a lot easier than being right, and so if there's something valuable about being wrong, I think that's good. It means it's much easier for us to succeed by failing, I guess. Okay. Epigraph for the talk. It's one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Reid in a long book where he spends a great deal of time talking about how absolutely wrong David Hume gets everything he ever says. That's not the only thing he says in the book, but he does return to that theme a lot. This is the best example of a backhanded compliment I've seen in philosophy. And what he said is, a system of consequences, however absurd, acutely and justly drawn from a few principles, in very abstract matters, is of real utility in science, and may be made subservient to real knowledge. This merit Mr. Hume's metaphysical writings have in a great degree. Or in other words, Hume is absurd and saying ridiculous things, but at least he's doing it in a systematic, consistent fashion. Okay, so I want to start by talking about doomed proposals. And as is my natural tendency, I'm going to use an analogy from a field that I have no expertise in. But I'm going to pretend for a moment that the whole world has no expertise in this field. So we're going to pretend that we live in a world where there is no Colosseum. Sorry, the Colosseum exists, but there's no records of how it was built. Okay? And we don't even have general knowledge of construction techniques or architecture. But we've got some scholars who are looking at this giant building and they're trying to figure out how on earth was this building built. Nice picture of the Colosseum. Big, impressive structure. I mean, it was probably more impressive before it was ruins, but still very impressive even as ruins. Okay, and now suppose that this scholar comes along and they say, well, here's my theory of how the Colosseum was built. There's just three things involved. Number one was a bucket. Number two, a shovel. And I had to look to find like the child's plastic shovel. We want this to be a ridiculous theory. And whatever amount of sand you want, okay? As much sand as you want, but all you have is a bucket and a shovel, those are your only resources, and that is all they needed to build the Colosseum. Okay. Now, I guess if the top of the slide didn't give it away, even though I don't know anything about architecture or construction, I know that this story is wrong. I look at those resources, and I look at the Colosseum, and I'm in a good position to say, no, you cannot build a Colosseum out of a bucket, a shovel, and unlimited quantities of sand. You need something else. I don't know what else, but you need more than that. So I conclude that obviously won't work. Okay? Obviously that scholar's story is crackpot. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, in my experience, for many philosophers, both students and faculty, this is about how they feel about what's going on in the history of philosophy. Okay? They basically feel like these historical figures, we're going to be talking about David Hume today, but in general, I feel like these historical figures are offering theories that are as obviously wrong as that story of how to build the Colosseum. And so there's a background question, how on earth could it be worthwhile for us to study these obviously incorrect views? Oops, sorry, I forgot to flip the pages of my guide here as I went. Okay. Now, my goal today, in this talk, is just to explain one way that it could be worthwhile for us to study obviously wrong views. Okay? It's not the only way that they could be worthwhile. There's a lot of other interesting proposals people could come up with. And it's not the only way to pursue studying things in general. I don't think you should always start with obviously wrong views. But I think it's one case you can make for studying obviously wrong views. And my plan is to begin with David Hume as a case study, because he is the philosopher who I spend most of my time working on. And then we're going to draw some broader conclusions from there. That's the plan of attack. Okay. So now, in his work, The Treatise of Human Nature, David Hume took on a great number of commitments that massively limit the explanatory resources at his disposal. By the way, he wrote The Treatise of Human Nature before he was 30. So anybody who's got 30 in their sights and you have not written one of the most important works in philosophy, you are not going to tie David Hume, I guess. Okay. But, at any rate, so he takes on all these commitments in his theorizing that are going to massively limit the resources. It's going to make it look like he's got the bucket, the shovel, and the sand. And those, here are some examples of those. He commits himself to the copy principle. And the copy principle says all of our ideas have to be copied from prior experiences. And so that means any ideas that aren't something you can trace back to experience aren't ideas you can have at all. And so you can't think about things except via these experiential routes. He's got this notion of force and vivacity that is the only resource he has for distinguishing between different mental states that are built out of the same ideas. And even between mental states that are built out of ideas and mental states that are built out of impressions or experiences. In addition, he's got this commitment to molecularism. And molecularism is the view, comes from the same root as when we talk about molecules, that complex ideas are sort of, have a literal recipe in terms of which simple ideas they're built out of. And so this commits him to saying there are complex ideas, there are simple ideas, and every complex idea has to be sort of like a Lego construction out of the simpler ones. And then the only other sort of major element he has in his view that he can appeal to is a principle of association. Like the way that when I say salt, your mind is tending to go towards pepper, because for various reasons you associate salt and pepper. That sort of association is the backbone of Hume's theory of how mental states get related to each other. Now, you might be looking at these resources, or these restrictions on resources, and maybe you're not so worried, because after all, how good the resources are depends on what he's trying to do with them. So, his goals wind up being crazy ambitious, okay? Maybe some of the most ambitious goals you could have. Hume aimed to offer an account of all human mental activity. Literally everything that goes on in the human mind. Imagination, judgment, reason, emotion, the will, and moral attitudes. And his only resources he's allowed to draw on are those. So that's why I think he's a good candidate for looking a lot like the Colosseum case. He's got basically a children's playground sandbox full of resources, and he's trying to explain everything. So it's very natural, I think, to say the following. You look at that, you've got extremely limited resources and extremely ambitious goals, and that's a recipe for failure, okay? In general, if you're trying to accomplish a task, suppose you had some project and you're trying to set up the budget, and I tell you, all right, just do 1/3 of the budget, whatever you had budgeted, just do 1/3, odds are you're not going to succeed, because I'm just cutting down drastically the resources that are available to you. So I think, similar to the Colosseum case, one can look at Hume's project and look at his resources, and justifiably think to yourself, that's obviously not going to work. Okay? So I think this is an important starting point, because when I'm trying to explain today why I think it's valuable to look at the history of philosophy, I want us all to be on the same page, that this is a case that I'm making to people who start looking at Hume, and the first thing they do is say, well, it's going to be wrong. What's the point of looking at it? Okay? So I think Hume's a good candidate for thinking, when we look at it, odds are his system's going to be wrong. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of Hume's. I think he was a brilliant philosopher, but I think it's fair to say that if you look at his system, it's just drastically underpowered for what it's trying to do. So here's an example of how it seems to be drastically underpowered. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to try and draw some broader conclusions about why you should care about historical philosophy if you care about other types of philosophy, contemporary philosophy. So one result of the constraints that Hume lays out is that he has to give an account of belief, not just belief, all cognitive activities, as fundamentally different types of sensory imagination. Okay? So when you think about what it is to believe, for example, that Fredonia is a city, okay? A belief that many of you probably have, since you are familiar with the city of Fredonia. You have to build that belief on Hume's story out of nothing but mental pictures. And when I say pictures, I don't mean just visual pictures. It could be auditory images as well as visual images, but sensory images that come with varying degrees of strength or vivacity, and then mental associations between them. So that's one of the things he has to do on his story. He's got to use those resources to explain what it is to believe that Fredonia is a city. And you might be sitting there thinking, as I think is a very plausible reaction, that when you believe that Fredonia is a city, it's not the case that you have a little picture of the city in your head, and some other picture that corresponds to being a city, and then you're going to somehow put those two together to get the belief. But most of us feel like our beliefs like that just aren't picture-driven, the way that Hume's story sounds like it's going to have to be. So this is, I think, it's good because we've got now a recipe for Hume to fail. And that might sound like a bad idea, like why do we want Hume to fail? But it's really good because we can investigate whether or not he fails, and if he does, the way in which he fails. So Thomas Reid is, like many of you I'm sure, not a fan of the theory of belief that Hume gives. Hume's theory of belief, by the way, the core theory of belief, winds up being just this. Believing something is just like imagining it, but more forceful. So the difference between imagining a unicorn and believing in a unicorn is just how lively of an imagination you have. Okay? And that should sound, I think, laughable. And here is Thomas Reid saying how laughable it is. That a strong belief and a weak belief differ only in degree, I can easily comprehend. So he's like, I'll give you that. If you want to say strong beliefs and weak beliefs differ just by how strong they are, that sounds plausible. But that belief and no belief should differ only in degree, that is, believing versus merely imagining, no man can believe who understands what he speaks. So, Thomas Reid attempting to call Hume out. Hume did not rise to the bait. Frustrating for many of us scholars. We want to see what Hume would say back to Reid in response to some of these charges, and he does not really ever directly engage all these criticisms. On the bright side, it leaves more work for those of us studying Hume, so mixed bag. Okay. So, one way to think about Reid's complaint is that belief is just a different sort of thing from imagining. If you've got a theory of how the mind works, you better have a big difference between those two. Not just that they're far apart on some scale, but they need to be in different categories entirely. Okay, it's got to be a difference of kind rather than a difference of degree. And I want to right now, let's suppose he's right. Okay? Let's just suppose that if your view is going to have anything going for it, you would better treat imagination as a different sort of mental activity from belief. And it's clear that no matter what else Hume says, you're going to have to take my word for this because you haven't all read the treatise, but you're going to have to take my word for this. No matter what else Hume says, he's going to have to say that they are the same sort of thing. He's going to have to say that belief is the same kind of mental state as imagining, it just has some variation in how strong it is. So, should we just stop reading Hume? Now, if you were like some of my students that I have taught in the past, your reaction to that question is yes. Of course, we found out he's wrong. What more is there to learn? My answer is no, we should not stop reading Hume, even if we take for granted that he simply can't be right. And I say that because we can know that Hume's account is incorrect without understanding or knowing why Hume's account is incorrect or doomed, as I'm calling it to try and make this sort of sound more exciting, using terminology. Incorrect, I guess, or doomed. So we can know that Hume's account is wrong without knowing why it's wrong. Now, there's a sense of knowing why it's wrong where you might say we do know why it's wrong. We know it's wrong because he says that belief and imagination are the same sort of thing, and they're actually different sorts of things. But I have something a little bit richer in mind for what it takes to know why Hume is wrong. See, a more complicated view, a view that has two categories of mental state, can do more things than a simpler view. That's one of the reasons that you go in for a more complicated view, is it's got more moving parts, and so they can move in different ways, you get more complex behaviors out of it. So if we need to have this more complex view in order to account for the differences between belief and imagination, then there has to be something that the more complex view can do that Hume's view can't. There's got to be something riding on whether we say they're the same sort of activity or different sorts of activity, and that's got to be a thing that's going on that's special to belief that we need in order to separate it from imagination. And so, to my mind, understanding why Hume goes wrong requires us to identify that thing. What is it that we need to have two categories there for? Because it's one thing to step back and be like, well, yeah, they just seem like different categories. It's another thing to really understand how it is that they diverge. And truly understanding why Hume's system can't account for belief, understanding why it's doomed, I think that all by itself would be substantive progress in philosophy. Because then we would understand something important about belief. Any good account of belief is going to have this feature. Okay? It won't be enough to just have two categories. You'll need to be doing the right thing with those two categories. And we can find out what that thing is by looking at what David Hume says, by looking at what you'd need to do to fix David Hume. Or where it is that David Hume's account breaks down. So it would help us outline better what's needed for a promising view to understand what makes Hume's view so bad, beyond just that it doesn't meet this one criterion. We also want to know why is it that that's an important thing for a view to do. So doomed proposals, because as I said, I like the more ominous terminology, that is, those with sparse resources and ambitious goals, and this is something that history of philosophy is full of, people who are trying to lay out a system and have basically a box of Cracker Jacks to work with, and are trying to explain the entire universe, okay? Hume's proposals have the following two features. Because they have ambitious goals, they're going to make it easy for us to find challenges that they are on the hook to meet, okay? If your goal is to explain everything, it should be really easy for me to find problems with your view, because I can find anything that your view is supposed to do, and if it can't do it, you're still on the hook for your view to do it. And secondly, because you have sparse resources, it should be easier for us to exhaust the different ways you could try and do that thing, okay? If your view only has two moving parts, if your view only has two tricks up its sleeve, and there's a problem that your view is trying to solve, we try both tricks. And if neither trick works, then we've learned that you need more tricks in your bag in order to accomplish that task. So, I want to say it's because such views are a recipe for failure, literally because they are likely to be doomed and wrong in all sorts of ways, that they are exactly the targets of our investigation that we should have, exactly what we should be focusing on. But now in order to get something out of the investigation, we need to really do our best. It's not okay to, I was about to say half-ass, I probably shouldn't. And yet I did. I guess cat's out of the bag now. It's not okay to half-ass your defense of this person, okay? If you want to find out whether or not Hume's view can do it, you gotta work to your full potential, I guess to say it in a slightly more decorous manner. You gotta work to your full potential to ensure that you're doing the absolute best by Hume's view that you can. Otherwise, you haven't really found out that views like Hume's are doomed. So, doomed views are good because we should be able to figure out that they're doomed and why. But in order to really do a good job of it, we need to spend our time trying to, we gotta put on our Hume hat and say, what is the absolute best Hume could do to face this challenge? Okay? So that's sort of framing the approach to history that I think is valuable, is putting on your Hume hat and trying, in the face of what you expect to be almost certain failure, to figure out how close you can get to success on Hume's behalf. So for Hume on belief, for example, we could start by looking at some obvious differences between belief and imagination. And here are a few. Beliefs seem to influence our behavior in a way that imagination doesn't. Beliefs are the sorts of things that we describe as incorrect or false, but if somebody's just imagining like a unicorn, you're not like, oh, that imagining is false. But if they believe there's a unicorn, you'd be like, well, that's wrong, there are no unicorns. I hope I'm not spoiling anybody's day to tell you that there are no unicorns. And then beliefs seem to be involuntary in a way that imagining isn't. If I just tell you, pick an animal, any animal you like, and imagine it, you can all close your eyes and do that right now. If I tell you, pick an animal, any animal you like, and believe that it's here in this room, you will find that a little bit more troublesome. I hope. If anybody can do it on command, let me know. We've got to talk a lot after my talk. So now, I think that first one is pretty easy for Hume to explain. The first one being the influence of belief on action. And that's because things we merely imagine, they influence our behavior as well. Okay? I don't always believe that something is going wrong, but sometimes when I'm, say, lying in my bed on a cold Buffalo evening, and I hear something that could be a tree branch scraping against my outside of my house, or it could be a crazed robber. It's not that I believe that there's a crazed robber there, but I do get slightly more nervous. I might behave slightly differently. I might go and lock my doors, even though I don't think it's a robber, even though I've just imagined a robber. It seems like in some cases, it's just a difference in degree, the difference between imagining something and full-on believing it, how much it's going to influence your actions. Now, I don't mean to give the whole story here, because we don't have time to get into the whole story, but just as an example, it looks like this is not a promising candidate for saying where Hume's going to go wrong, because that looks like it could be a difference in degree. You've got to have a whole detailed story behind it, but... Now, the other two differences are trickier, but they can also be explained as the result of differences in degree. And here's why they're trickier. The differences look sharp, okay? Voluntary, involuntary looks like it should be sort of, there's two boxes, the things that are voluntary, the things that are involuntary, and so we should sort them that way. And similar for things that we assess as true or false versus things that just don't seem like they're up in the air for that assessment. It's not like when you really strongly imagine something, we're like, oh, that's almost false. Like, we just don't even think of things as false or true until they're beliefs. So, if the differences are sharp rather than gradual, it looks really hard to explain it on a model where all you have is differences in degree. But I think that there are scenarios that we can look to in the world where we do get thresholds, this sort of sharp cutoff arising from differences in degree. And my case here is people pushing boulders. I tried to find a good image for this, but it was difficult to find a good image of people pushing boulders. Harder than I would have anticipated at any rate. But you can imagine you got a bunch of people. We'll make them all identical twins so that they're going to exert the exact same amount of force on the boulder. And so each person is going to add a little bit of force when they push on this boulder. Now the first person pushes on the boulder doesn't move. Second person joins in, boulder still doesn't move. You get to enough people though, all of a sudden the boulder goes from not moving to moving. And that looks like it should be a sharp cutoff. It's a threshold. There's the minimum amount of pushing that you need to get the boulder to move at all. And then, past that threshold, it's a degree. How fast the boulder moves depends on how much pushing you have. And so it looks like if you were to chart the pushing, the amount of force being pushed, you'd get a nice slopey chart. But if you were to chart the boulder's motion, there'd be a sharp cutoff for when the boulder starts moving, and then the speed would increase with the additional pressure. And so, I think that's a good reason to think that you can get a difference in degree producing a threshold effect. So I don't think Hume is toast there. But, point one, if we put Hume's resources to work in clever ways, we can overcome some of these challenges. So that's one. I don't claim to have shown you exactly how to do it there. I just sort of gestured in the direction of we should think there's maybe a chance. Okay? Hopefully some of you will be excited about that and think more about it and then tell me why it's still not the same thing. There's a big important disanalogy. It's not going to work. That'd be great. But I just think it's sort of enough to say, hey, we got to do some more work here. We can't just say it's a sharp cutoff so Hume can't explain it. And we might even, at this point, though we're not for the purpose of this talk, we might even start questioning whether Reid's complaint has as much going for it as it seemed. It seemed so obvious that belief and imagination were different. But we might, once we start seeing the different ways in which you can be clever with Hume's resources, you might figure out a way to undermine some of Reid's complaint. But the point today is not that Hume might turn out to be right, because at the end of the day I don't think Hume's going to turn out to be right about most of these issues with his system, though I think it would be neat. And I made sure to note that, so in case I forgot, that it would be super neat if Hume turned out to be right. But the point is that the grounds for pessimism about Hume's system, the reasons we have for thinking that his system is going to fall on its face, are also grounds for optimism that we could make philosophical progress by investigating Hume's system. Because each and every one of the differences between belief and imagination that we can knock out and explain on Hume's system, that's one step closer to understanding why it is that you really do need two categories of mental state and a deep difference between belief and imagination. If in fact you need one, which we're pretending for purposes of this talk. Or we're taking for granted, not pretending. Okay, so now I'm going to move to a slightly more general. I haven't claimed to solve this problem. I just want to give you a taste of exactly the sort of activity we'd be undergoing if we take my advice about how to approach historical philosophy. So now, inquiry more generally. This is sort of the conclusion of the talk for anybody who's getting antsy. So let's take it for granted that philosophical inquiry involves the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. I think that should be fairly uncontroversial, but you cannot have a group this large of people who think about philosophy together without somebody who's going to disagree, but we're just going to take this for granted for now. Now we might think of inquiry as proceeding in the following way. We've got our table in front of us, and all of these things on our table are live options. Okay? All the different possible answers to the question we're investigating. And the goal is to get all the bad ones off the table so we're just left with the correct one. Okay? It's a model of inquiry I think a lot of people have in their minds. And that picture of how we think about inquiry, I don't know if they think about it in terms of a table, but they've got this sort of, we're trying to eliminate the bad options. It lends itself to picking up an option off the table, investigating it, and trying to find a reason to take it off the table. And so you're only ever paying attention to options that are still on the table when you're trying to figure out what to do. You look at the table, you say, oh, there's an option, we could try and get rid of that one. There's another option, let's try and get rid of that one. After all, if your options are A through Z, and you eliminate A, that puts you're zeroing in on the right answer. You've gotten a little bit closer, because now you've only got B through Z to worry about. Okay. I don't know why I switched from inquiry to conclusion there. I'm really bad at titling slides, I guess is the main answer. So, this attitude of repeatedly calling our list of live options, trying to scrape them away, what that means is that our focus is always going to be on the live options. And I think this mentality is misguided, and I'm going to try and use what I was just talking about with Hume to explain why. But I also want to note, one thing it does, that mentality, is it makes it very hard to work with people who disagree with you about which table options on the table are live options. Because if your goal is to get options off the table and they want to keep an option on the table, then the two of you are fighting over whether or not that option should be on the table. instead of working together to figure out other things, which will be on the next slide. Okay. So my approach, the situation is more like this. You are trying to build a promising view from parts. But in order to know which parts you want to use, you have all these other views on the table, and they all have their own moving parts. And so you want to investigate those views and figure out what their moving parts can do. And if you figure out that their moving parts are really good at this technique, or this strategy, or good for solving this problem, you can sort of harvest those parts from the one view and put them in the view that you're trying to construct. And you'll be like, oh, if we need a view that's really good at tracking this difference between belief and imagination, we'll just use this part from that view over there. But you only know what parts to take from a given view if you figure out what all those different views can do. And I'm going to note now, you may have noticed once we start talking generally, nothing about this has to do with historical philosophy in particular, which is nice. I think this view of inquiry is also going to explain what value there is in engaging with contemporary views that you reject. Because you disagree with all sorts of people about things, but on this view, you and your opponent, whether or not you disagree about the question of which view is right, you both want to know what the best that view can do is. So even if you think they're dead wrong, okay, you think you're a diehard four-dimensionalist about persistence through time, they're a big three-dimensionalist, you both want to know what the best view of three-dimensionalism looks like, you both want to know what the best version of four-dimensionalism looks like, and you both want to figure that out so you can tell which view is really right. I guess the same thing I was just saying, but with the letter X instead of a specific view. Everyone has an interest in knowing how well the best version of a given view fares. And it's already easy for us to see why advocates of that view want to know what the best version looks like. But I think here we can see why even people who think that view is wrong or misguided still want to know what the best version looks like. Because then they understand where that view is really going wrong. Not just that it's false, but why it's false. And if you understand why it's false, then you can make more progress in figuring out what a good view should look like. And so, last slide, I promise. Second last slide, actually. Shouldn't have promised. You can't build the Colosseum out of sand using only a shovel and a bucket. I'm granting that. But determining how close you can get can be extremely instructive. Okay? So if we're living in a world where we literally knew nothing about construction techniques, I don't think this crackpot guy's idea would be a bad thing to start from to try and figure out, well, what can you do with a bucket, a shovel, and sand? And I think one thing that we'll take away from that, if we spend a lot of time sort of doing this project on these doomed proposals, is that we'll be surprised by the results. And here I've got a picture of a sandcastle Colosseum. So thank you. That's my talk.